What's up, Pilkers? Jojo Prime here, and today we'll be listing the top 10 greatest thrash metal albums of all time, according to you. About a month ago, I asked you guys, and I also went on Reddit asking what you thought were the greatest thrash metal albums of all time. And the reason why I do it this way is that there's typically a consensus of what the greatest albums in these styles of music are, and people generally agree on this when they're talking it from an objective point of view. But when you ask people personally what they think are actually the greatest albums in this type of music, you might end up with an entirely different consensus. So in case you haven't watched my video on what are the 10 greatest death metal albums of all time, I came up with a couple of rules to make this kind of thing. Number 1, the way an album is included on the list depends on how many people mention it specifically. Number 2, I only include the official full-length studio albums, so no demos or EPs. Number 3, no one band can be featured more than once on the list. I know many bands have several important albums that deserve to be mentioned, but I wanted to give every band a fair shot. So if a particular band has several albums being mentioned, I will include the album that was mentioned the most and fit it onto the list accordingly. But before we get into the list, I gotta give a big shout out to today's sponsor, Gothic. Gothic Jewelry is a company that mainly focuses on men's accessories. Now, I, like most of you, love wearing metal shirts, but I also like to look stylish. So I like using a bit of jewelry to spice up my looks. I mean, I'm wearing a Sepultura Bestial Devastation shirt and I think I still look pretty fine. And here's the thing, most men's jewelry is kinda cringe, and here's where Gothic comes in. They have several different styles of rings, bracelets, necklaces, and more. So whatever your preferences might be, they should have something for you. Gothic is currently running a Valentine's Day sale, and I think their New Year's sale is still active. And if you use promo code JOJO20 at checkout, you get a 20% discount on your first order. And I do get a small commission off of it. So if any of this sounds interesting to you and you want to get yourself some cool accessories or give your significant other a nice Valentine's Day gift and support the channel too, make sure to check out Gothic in the link in the description down below or in the pinned comment on this video. But with that out of the way, let's get to the list. The number 10 on this list isn't any of the typical names that you would expect when talking about this topic. It's actually Artillery with their 1990 album By Inheritance. Now, when you think of thrash metal and the 90s in the same context, that's not typically a good thing. But in this case, it's a fairly interesting album. This is an album that has a lot of the standard thrash metal elements, but it's also quite melodic, having almost a Middle Eastern flavor to it. The vocals are pretty good to genuinely great at times, which is not typically the case with a lot of thrash metal bands, especially in the 90s. And there's very subtle hints of them drawing inspiration from old school prog metal like Queensryche. I've read a lot of comments of people saying that this album sounds like Metallica style production with the technicality of Megadeth riffs, but of course with that Middle Eastern vibe added to it. Some people even calling it a masterpiece. And it's not a bad place to start off this list. Next up at number 9 is Dark Angel with their album Darkness Descends. Released in 1986, this is an absolutely ferocious album, falling more into the Slayer camp of thrash metal and featuring one of my favorite drummers of all time, that being Gene Hoglan. As much as I enjoy this album, I can't deny that it sounds a bit messy at times. Maybe it's due to the production not being that great, but it does have many wild and notable songs like The Burning of Sodom. Gene Hoglan, of course, giving a killer performance, and I think this is the first album he ever performed, like, ever. There's not much else to say about this album other than it's a lot of fun, and it's a quick way to get you pumped if you love thrash metal. Now with number 8, it's Testament with their debut album, The Legacy. Released in 1987, is regarded by many people as their best album ever. I'm many people. This is the album that always makes me think that Testament should be in the Big Four. And aside from maybe the vocals, this album's production holds up to this day almost 36 years later. This is not to say that the vocals sound bad, it's just that the mix on them is very much a product of its time. What's really cool about this album is that while still being pretty heavy, it's actually quite accessible too, with iconic riffs written by Eric Peterson and some of the coolest thrash metal solos provided by Alex Skolnick. This album definitely deserves a spot on this list. Next up on number 7, it's Demolition Hammer with their 1992 album Epidemic of Violence. Yes, another 90s thrash metal album. Above Testament. This album is aggressive as fuck! Sometimes bordering on death thrash territory. This album is proof that you can have a logo and a cover that kinda sucks and still have great music. I was a bit surprised on how much love this album was getting when compiling the mentions, and I can hear why. The production on it is quite good for its time. It's very heavy without relying so much on speed all the time. The vocals are pretty aggressive too. There's nothing really new or innovative about it, it's just really well done. And you know what? I'm glad it made it onto the list. It definitely keeps it interesting. Following this, at number 6 is Sodom with their 2001 album, M16. Out of all the Sodom albums that could have made it onto the list, I actually never expected it to be this one. I've read some comments of people saying that listening to this album is kinda like hearing Slayer's Out of Heaven for the first time. Sodom being one of those proto-black bands from the early 80s, referenced quite often by early black metal bands as an influence. They were a very fast and evil sounding band. However, this album is quite slower than what you will expect from them. But oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, this worked really well for them, because this album features one of Sodom's most popular songs, Napalm in the Morning. I'm just really surprised that most people mention an album of theirs that it's this late in their career. But regardless, Sodom is an undeniably important band for this genre, and it's most definitely deserving a spot on this list. Now, number 5, it's an album that I like a lot, and its creator with Pleasure to Kill. It is their second album, released in 1986, and is one of the most ferocious releases of their time. But apart from being fast and heavy, this album has a very evil vibe permeated all over it. Mila's vocals sound just straight up nasty in here, like an evil goblin that's about to eat you after beating you up. And just like I mentioned with Sodom, Creator, at least at this time, was considered one of those proto-black bands. This album sounds a bit messy at times, but in a very enjoyable way. The rawness and sheer attitude of it definitely adds to its enjoyment for a fan of this kind of music. And I can hear how this sound inspired many bands, not just in thrash metal, but later on death and black metal too. So I'd say it being on the top 5 is definitely fitting. At number 4, it's Sepultura with Beneath the Remains. Ah yes, Sepultura. Usually when people talk about iconic thrash metal bands, they mostly mention American bands, typically from the Bay Area or from Germany. But for some reason, Brazil was a big exporter of a very aggressive thrash metal in the mid to late 80s, with bands such as Executor, Holocausto, Volcano, and of course the very influential Sarcophago. Now, out of all the bands that came out of Brazil in this era, Sepultura was definitely the most successful of them all. And Beneath the Remains falls directly in the middle of what some people call the golden era of Sepultura, when they were a straightforward thrash metal band. From 1987 with their album Schizophrenia, and ending on 1991 with Arise. Their sound at this time definitely falls in the camp that the 80s German thrash metal scene, just like Slayer, falls in, with this very evil sounding style to this genre. I can definitely hear why so many people mention this particular album. It's evil and aggressive, but it's not just speed all the time. There's some very cool leads tastefully placed here and there, as well as many mid-paced heavy riffs, as opposed to being an album chock full of shredding. Also, the production is fairly good for its time, so you'd be able to understand everything that's going on while still keeping some of that rawness and attitude. I'd say the song Lobotomy is the one that best summarizes the most prevalent elements that define this album. It would have been sacrilege if Sepultura didn't make it onto the list, and they're most definitely deserving of being in the top 5. Now, reaching the top 3 on this album, we have Metallica with Injustice for All, released in 1998. It's their 4th album and the first one featuring Jason Newsted on bass. I mean, it features him, but you can't really hear him. Yeah, this album is infamous for having the bass so low in the mix that it's basically inaudible. Thanks, Lars. And Justice for All, as good as it is definitely hindered by this. While revisiting the album to make this video, I noticed that it definitely sounds weaker than Metallica albums that came before and after it. Almost like it's got a hole in it. But regardless, it's one of Metallica's best written albums ever, often referred as their prog album for its usage of all-time signatures and various changes in style and mood while still keeping that thrash metal bass. It also features one of the most iconic songs ever, not just in thrash metal, but in metal as a whole, One. So it's no surprise why it made it this far. Or maybe it's because everybody wanted to be different and not mention Master of Puppets. But let's move along. At number 2, it's Slayer with, of course, Raining Blood. Released in 1986, this album needs no introduction. I'd say this is the quintessential thrash metal album. When I think of thrash metal, this is what pops into my head first. And I believe it's the same for many of you. Yeah, you can say X or Y Slayer album is better, But the truth is, this is the definitive album in terms of them defining their own identity and also having the production that allows their sound to translate. And I mean, there's so many iconic songs on this album like Angel of Death, Piece by Piece, Necrophobic, Postmortem, Jesus Saves, and of course, Raining Blood. A lot of the things I said about Sodom and Creator can be applied here too. And what else can I say about this album that hasn't already been said? Peak Jeff Hanneman riffing here, Dave Lombardo set the bar for the next generation of drummers in terms of speed and precision, which he attributes Shane Hogland for. Before we get to number 1, let's do some honorable mentions of albums that got mentioned a lot but didn't make it onto the list. Of course, Metallica's Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, Exodus with Bonded by Blood, Overkill with Years of Decay, Sepultura with The Rise, every other Slayer album from the 80s, Persecution Mania by Sodom, my favorite Sodom album, and also Agent Orange got mentioned a lot, and a newer band, Power Trip with Nightmare Logic. Rest in peace, Riley Gale. At a number 1, what could be the greatest thrash metal albums above Slayer and Metallica and Sepultura and Creator and whatnot? Megadeth with Rest in Peace. Look, I've never been the biggest fan of Megadeth, but if there's an album that deserves to be on this list, it's Rest in Peace. It's one of their more interesting albums, having genuinely cool leads and melodies spread all over it. A big example of this being the beginning of Lucretia or the entirety of Hangar 18. It also has a lot of fun but very interesting and quite technical riffs, like in the beginning of Techno Prisoners or the main riff in Poison Was the Cure. It also has 2 very iconic songs, those being Holy Wars and Tornado of Souls. No, I don't like Tornado of Souls for the most part, but the guitar solos are very cool. And I'll just get this out of the way. Yes, Megadeth solos are way more interesting than Metallica's. And I mean, I gotta recognize that Megadeth has always had some incredible guitar players. Whether it be Chris Poland or Marty Friedman or Chris Broderick or whoever else. And of course, currently with the amazing Kiko Loureiro, formerly of Angra. But yeah, for the most part, this album is some of the most interesting thrash metal of its time. If you ignore Voivod. Most of the songs here are super technical in a very enjoyable way, and if you're not so much into this style of metal but are more like a prog head, there might be many elements in this album that you might enjoy. After giving it a few more listens, I still don't like Tornado of Souls for the most part. I couldn't give a rat's ass about Dawn Patrol. The beginning of the title track is pretty cool. It loses me as soon as the vocals come in. And that's another thing about Megadeth. The vocals always take me out. Like, I get that most people that listen to metal don't really care about the vocals, and I mean, I enjoy vocals that could be considered worse. But I don't know, I always found Dave Mustaine's voice kind of annoying. I don't think they're as annoying here as in most of his work, but yeah, it's a big gripe for me. I do have some respect for the man. He is a very talented guitar player and riff writer, but man, those vocals. I do understand why so many people mention this album. I mean, when I was listening to it, there was many moments that I was like, damn, that's a very cool riff. That's a pretty cool melody. But number 1, that's up to you. But that is it. Let me know if you agree with this list or if you would have done it a little different. Personally, I would have. Let me know in the comments down below. Also, I did this in the other videos and at the risk of a Farben lawsuit. Here's the pie chart. If you like this video, please click the like button down below, and if you're not subscribed, well, go ahead and do it. If you don't, well, one day your knees will buckle under the weight of your endless sins. If you're already subscribed, make sure to click the notifications bell so you never miss a new video. Once again, a big shout out to today's sponsor, Gothic. Make sure to check them out in the link in the description down below or in the pinned comment on this video. All my social media links and my Discord sub link will be in the description down below, as always, so please go ahead and check them out, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.